I'm not going to pretend that this is enjoyable reading, but it is essential reading. This is not exaggeration. This is what is going on in the world right now. As we conduct this interview, there are people running, living in fear of ISIS. Just the last couple of days, we've heard about more massacres. I'd like to say to you that'll be the end of it. Nothing more will happen. That's ridiculous. Much more will happen. Johnnie Moore, thank you for writing it. As I said, not enjoyable, but essential reading. It's published now, just the last, you could put another chapter in as we speak. It keeps on happening. This story is being written as we speak to one another.
Yeah, I mean, since the book is written, we've seen thousands of other Christians displaced or killed. And to your point, it's an important book. And I'll tell you, when I was writing the book, there were moments where, even now talking about it, where I was moved on a very, very deep and emotional level, because these are my brothers and sisters in Christ, in some of the most ancient Christian communities on planet Earth, and they face the threat of elimination. They've survived thousands of years to be eliminated in the 21st century.
We should establish, though, look, the victims of ISIS, the vast majority of the victims of ISIS are Muslim.
No, that's true. They've killed more Muslims than anyone else, and Yazidis and Kakais and Mandeans and Shiites and everybody. They're equal opportunity psychopaths.
Yeah. Look, if they could get their hands on Jewish people, the same thing would happen. It's a form of a vicious, repugnant triumphalism. Most Muslims would reject them. However, I want to... Let's be realistic here. For example, when ISIS murdered some Egyptian Christians, the Egyptian people and government said this is wrong, it's terrible. It was a bit hypocritical because Christians are persecuted by people who have nothing to do with ISIS. I try to establish this in my book. In most Muslim countries, not in some, in most, Christians are persecuted, if not killed, are living in fear. They're fleeing Iraq, they're fleeing Syria, Egypt. The community is large enough, but they're very frightened. So it's not a rosy picture wherever you go.
Yeah, but what we're seeing is an escalation on a scale that no one anticipated. And by the way, we're getting accustomed to it. I mean, I remember when the Coptics were beheaded, 20 of them, 20 Coptics and one person from Ghana. The whole world was enraged. I mean, you couldn't turn on a television or look at a newspaper. It was the front page of every newspaper.
For 24 hours.
For 24 hours.
Yeah.
And yet, here we are, and since then we've seen massacre after massacre. We had nearly 150 Christians that were college students in Kenya killed in cold blood. We had churches bombed in Pakistan. We just recently witnessed the massacre of 30 Ethiopian Christians. I mean, this is getting worse and it's getting worse, and the world seems to be getting quieter and quieter. And I just decided I'm going to tell the stories. And oddly enough, I was introduced to the plight of Christians in the Middle East by Muslims, by Muslim friends of mine in Jordan that said, hey, you need to pay attention to this. We're literally seeing happen to Christians what, by the way, happened to Jews in Iraq. There are now no Jewish people left in Iraq, and there could be no Christians left when this is all said and done.
Well, you mentioned Muslims who are speaking out. Andrew White, who's I think a mutual friend of ours, one of his assistants is she's a hijab-wearing Muslim. She's a dentist, actually. And there are many Muslims repulsed by what ISIS are doing, but they're in a difficult position because if they speak out, they're accused of being pro-Western or pro-Crusader or pro-Israeli. Complete misreading of their position, but they're caught between a rock and a hard place.
Well, I've said over and over, and I write in the book, that it's the best of faith that will defeat the worst of religion. That's what it's going to be.
That's very good.
It's going to be Muslims and Christians, everyone working together to combat this common enemy. That said, I'll just be honest with you, the politics are too complicated for me. They're intermingled, and in one level we're working with the Iranians in Iraq, on the other level we're pushing the Iranians back in Yemen, the United States and the coalition. I mean, it's all very, very complicated. So the one thing I wanted to do is speak up for these Christians that have no voice, to tell stories that aren't being told, and to call the whole world to do what the world hasn't been doing on the scale it needs to happen, and that is to provide help for these people. We're the rich church in the West. Just like the church in Antioch in the 1st century, when the church in Jerusalem was in a famine. And what happened? The church in Antioch reached out to the church in Jerusalem and provided what they need. Where we're witnessing a once-in-a-thousand-year crisis against Christians in the place of their birth, and we need to do more.
You do it extremely well. I'm glad you made this point, because if we try to get involved in the politics, and some Christians do, that's a no-win situation. Look, there have been times when Hezbollah, Iranian Shia militia, have stood there defending Christians against ISIS. So whose side do we take? It's far too complex. Let's get to the root of it, which is Christians generally impoverished, Not all, but many of them, the poorest communities. I've got to tell you, I mean, I don't know if you'll agree with me, but I get a bit upset when North American Christians say, we're being persecuted. It can be uncomfortable being a Christian today. Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe it'll sharpen the faith. But it's not persecution. This is real. This is, you don't know if your child will come home at the end of the day. You don't know if you will survive the week.
No, it's ISIS showing up in an ancient Christian town called Karakosh in Iraq and shooting their guns up in the air and yelling, so should we start with the elderly or the women and the children? Who will we behead first? It's ISIS kidnapping at will 5,000 Yazidi women and putting them on sex slave markets. In fact, we have documentation from within Iraq and Syria of the price lists of the Christian slaves, and they're categorized by age and religion. That's how the price lists are categorized. You can buy a Christian or Yazidi girl from 1 to 9 years old for $170. And the Bible tells me as a Christian that if one member of the body of Christ is suffering, that we're all suffering. Like that is my child that's being put on a slave market in Iraq and Syria, and we need to speak up. And I'll tell you, for all the stories of suffering, this book is filled with stories of inspiration, of Christians who, like every single one of those that have been beheaded by ISIS, the Egyptians, the Ethiopians, those in Iraq and Syria, every single Christian has been given the opportunity, convert or be killed. Pay the tax or be killed. And they've been killed over and over and over again because they embrace a Christianity that they're willing to die for when we're barely willing to live for it.
It's the most raw, direct, pertinent form of Christian belief. I want to talk a little about the motivation behind ISIS, because I think we can well understand, if not approve, of desperation that is a product of oppression or poverty. Many of the volunteers for ISIS are coming from middle-class European and North American homes. My hometown in England, there are people who've tried to get over there. They get to Turkey and go into Syria. What are they escaping? A national health service, welfare, tolerance, pluralism. They go there because they want to do this.
Well, and this is the answer to the question, why does this matter to me? Right? I mean, many people think, I care about these people, but it's halfway around the world. We've been involved in that part of the world too much already. It doesn't matter to me. Well, but ISIS is a different enemy. They represent 90 different countries. It's an enemy of educated terrorists that speak 2 or 3 languages, and you can rest assured, if they had the opportunity, they would do exactly here what they've done exactly there. That's in fact why the subtitle of the book is Preserving Christianity in the Place of Its Birth and in Your Own Backyard. Because in my country, I don't know anything about this country, but in my country, 1 out of 5 Arabic language tweets with the acronym ISIS in them in the United States of America are in support of ISIS.
20%.
20%.
20% of every tweet that concerns ISIS in Arabic is supportive of ISIS. That's quite incredible. I mean, in Canada, I have to say, I'm not being party political, the government has been quite good. It has spoken out. We have a special office to deal with religious freedom. We can always do more. But the military response, I think we have to, as Christians, say there is a time to say we must protect the vulnerable. But will it really achieve anything in the long run? I'm sure we'll stop them at some point, but we're not going to stop the ideology. We'll prevent the military expansion to a degree, but we won't expunge this obsessive notion that we have to kill Christians and kill anyone who is not like us.
Well, the response to ISIS needs to be threefold. It involves 3 words. The first word is rescue. We have to provide immediate humanitarian assistance to those in harm's way, Christians or otherwise. Secondly, we need to be prepared to restore these communities. And restoration involves preparing their lives. It means education. It means providing homes for them to live in again. Most of all, it means security. And that's the third word, and that's return. We have to rescue, we have to restore these communities, and then we have to return them. And so, even Pope Francis, even the Catholic Church is saying, these people need security.
Even the Catholic Church.
Well, of course, the pacifist Catholic Church that is very, very shy about any type of reference, any type of military involvement.
True. But can you really say to, Iraqi Christians, so, I mean, 2/3 now have been killed or have left, you really can say to them, we want you to return? It's very difficult to say to someone who is now living a fairly decent life in a diaspora in the States or Canada or the UK, go back there. I mean, I don't know if I'd be willing to go back there and take my young family.
Well, I am not telling anyone to return. I'm just saying they ought to have the opportunity to make their own choice. Yeah. And the world ought not to leave these people stranded in this horror movie that they're living in. And I mean, the fact is that just a couple of months ago, ISIS attacked 10 Christian villages along the Khabur River in Syria. They kidnapped 300 Christians in a convoy of 40 clearly marked ISIS vehicles. So 40 clearly marked ISIS vehicles went to 10 Christian villages, kidnapped 300 Christians. There wasn't a single airstrike. There wasn't a single attempt to repel those people. Like, the world isn't paying as close enough attention to this crisis. It's been discounted from the very beginning, and it's getting worse and worse. And here's what's getting worse. Now we're seeing other terrorist groups, ISIS affiliated and otherwise, being emboldened to persecute disbelievers in their own country, Muslim or Christian or whatever. So 150 Christians killed in Kenya, 30 Ethiopian Christians beheaded or shot to death in Libya. Of course, the beheading of the 21 Copts. And it's a very, very dangerous world we're living in.
We've just commemorated the Armenian massacres, a million. The Turks still deny that happened just a couple of days ago. At the end of the Second World War, I think it was 1944, the British were told that there were trucks full of Hungarian Jews going to death camps, and the Nazis at this point, knowing they were going to lose, were willing to hand them over. We'll give them over to safety. And the British Foreign Office, what would we do with 100,000 Jews? This has happened before. We live in the shame of it now. Let's not repeat and replicate that tragedy. Let's act while we can. Defying ISIS is the book. Johnnie Moore is the author. I highly recommend it. Again, it's not pleasing reading, but it's essential reading. Thank you so much for writing this.
Thanks for having me.